street was silent, almost too silent, like a wound waiting to be touched. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks and weathered buildings. A faint breeze rustled through the debris, but it did nothing to ease the heaviness that hung in the air. The only sound was the rhythmic click of crutches against the pavement. Devon's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to keep his balance, the weight of his legs dragging him down with every step. He leaned on his crutches for support, his face a mask of determination, though inside a storm was brewing. At 16, he'd learned to ignore the stares, the whispers, the looks of pity. But today, it felt different. Today, something was off. He had no idea why he was nervous. He'd walked this route 100 times before. He'd come from the corner store, his small puppy, Jack, trailing behind him on the leash, the dog's tiny paws tapping lightly on the concrete. Devon had gotten used to the feeling of Jack's warm presence by his side. The little creature had been his lifeline, a quiet companion when the world was too loud with prejudice and hate. But today, it felt like the city was holding its breath, like something was about to snap. As he reached the intersection, his eyes caught the glint of something up ahead, the flashing blue lights, slicing through the dimming daylight. A patrol car was parked on the curb, the officer sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead. The tension thickened. Devon's pulse quickened. The officer didn't move, but there was something in the air, something Devon couldn't shake. His gut told him this was no ordinary night. Jack barked nervously, tugging at the leash. Devon tried to soothe him, his own nerves bubbling to the surface. His grip tightened on the crutches as he adjusted his pace, moving a little faster, hoping to get past the patrol car without drawing attention. But fate wasn't kind. As he neared the car, the officer's door swung open with a sharp creak, and a tall man in uniform stepped out. The wind stilled, the world suddenly shrinking into that moment. "Hey you, stop right there," the officer commanded, his voice flat but authoritative. Devon froze. His heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let the fear show on his face. He knew the drill. No sudden movements, no reason to escalate things. But as the officer approached, his eyes were cold, devoid of anything resembling humanity. Devon's mind raced, his thoughts tangling in confusion and dread. What now? What did he want? "Where are you going?" the officer demanded, his eyes narrowing. Devon stood still, trying to hold his ground, trying to seem less of a target. "Just heading home," he answered quietly. The officer's lips twisted into something that barely passed for a smile, but it wasn't friendly, not in the slightest. "Home?" The officer looked him over, a quick, dismissive scan. "You're a long way from home, kid. Something's off about you." Devon's stomach sank. He could feel the heat of the officer's stare on his skin, and it made him want to shrink back. But he knew better. He couldn't show weakness. Not tonight. Not in this city. The officer took a step closer, his boots loud on the pavement. "I said, stop right there." A shiver ran through Devon's spine. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to ignore the officer, to keep moving and get out of this. But his legs, his cursed, useless legs, betrayed him. He couldn't outrun this. Not this time. And then, everything changed in an instant. The officer reached down, grabbing hold of Devon's crutches without warning. Devon gasped as his balance faltered. The officer yanked them out of his hands, throwing them to the ground with a violent clatter. Before Devon could react, the officer kicked his legs out from under him. The ground rushed up to meet him, hard and unforgiving. Jack barked frantically, tugging at his leash as Devon lay there, helpless. "Get up," the officer sneered, his voice filled with mockery. Devon's heart raced, his mind spinning. What was happening? Why was this happening? He tried to push himself up with his arms, but the officer kicked his crutches further away, out of his reach. "Didn't you hear me?" the officer growled. "I said, get up." Devon's pulse thundered in his ears. His hands shook as he struggled to push himself upright, but every movement felt like a betrayal. His crutches, his lifeline, were out of reach, and his legs, brittle, weak, had never felt more useless. The officer stepped back, eyeing him coldly, as if waiting for him to fail. And Devon, in that moment, realized something terrifying. This was never about the crutches. This was about breaking him. He swallowed the bitter taste of fear and tried to steady himself. But the officer wasn't finished. Not yet. Jack whimpered at his side, and Devon's breath caught in his throat as he saw the officer's hand rise. The dog was next, and Devon's world, the one he fought so hard to hold together, was about to shatter. Devon's breath caught in his throat as the officer's hand hovered over Jack, the small dog now trembling at his side. Every muscle in Devon's body locked up, the fear constricting his chest like a vice. The world around him seemed to slow down. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, the only sound that seemed real. The officer's cold eyes glinted as he looked down at the puppy, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile, but was far too sinister to be anything close to warmth. Jack whimpered, his small body cowering against Devon's leg, as though it could sense the danger closing in. "You think you're something special, don't you?" The officer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "A crippled little black boy with his dog. That's all you are, isn't it? Just another poor, broken piece of trash on the streets. Do you even know where you are, kid? Do you even know what happens to people like you?" Devon tried to speak, to defend himself, but the words were stuck in his throat. His body felt weak, his hands trembling with the strain of just existing in this moment. He could feel the officer's presence looming over him, like a dark cloud blocking out the sun. The officer bent down, his heavy boots grinding against the pavement as he reached for Jack. The puppy, now visibly terrified, barked again in a high-pitched yelp, trying to scramble away. But the officer's hand was quick, grabbing the dog by the scruff of its neck and lifting it off the ground. "Look at this," the officer said, lifting Jack up like a rag doll, the dog kicking and yelping in fear. "What's a little thing like you even doing with a pet? You don't deserve a damn thing, not a dog, not a future, not even a chance. You're just a reminder of everything that's wrong with this city." Devon's eyes burned with a mixture of rage and helplessness. His pulse thundered in his ears, the world spinning as the officer's words cut through him like a knife. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his crutches lay discarded behind him, out of reach. His body refused to cooperate, his legs numb and useless, leaving him at the mercy of this officer, a man who saw him as nothing more than a piece of trash to be disposed of. The officer shook the dog, ignoring its frantic struggles. Jack's legs flailed helplessly, his tiny body writhing in the officer's grip. "You want to know what happens to people like you?" The officer spat, his voice low and threatening. "You get put in your place. That's all you're good for." Without warning, the officer hurled Jack to the ground, the little dog landing with a sharp yelp on the pavement, its legs splayed out at an unnatural angle. The officer took a step back, as if savoring the moment, watching Devon's reaction. Devon's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the dog, the small creature whimpering in pain. It was his only friend, his only comfort, and now, that same officer had just taken it away from him. He felt the wave of helplessness crash over him, his chest tightening as tears burned at the corners of his eyes. "Get up!" the officer barked, his voice filled with venom. "Get up, or I swear I'll make your life even worse." But Devon couldn't move. He couldn't bring himself to do anything but stare at Jack, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He wanted to help the dog, to make it stop, but he couldn't even help himself. He was trapped, pinned under the weight of this officer's hatred, his own vulnerability exposed for the world to see. The officer leaned in, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "This is what happens to people like you, boy. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. And that's the way it's always going to be." He grabbed Devon by the collar of his shirt, pulling him up roughly until their faces were inches apart. The officer's breath reeked of alcohol, his voice a low growl of menace. "Did you think you were going to get away with this? Did you think you were special? No one cares about you. You're just another poor, angry little nigger who doesn't know his place." Devon's chest tightened at the words, the slur hitting him like a physical blow. He'd heard it before, of course. He'd grown up in a world where the color of his skin determined his worth, where people like him were seen as less than human, always under someone's boot. But hearing it now, in this moment, from the man who held all the power, felt different. It felt like a death sentence. Devon fought back the tears that threatened to spill, forcing himself to look the officer in the eye. He wouldn't let him see him break. Not here, not now, not in front of him. But the officer wasn't done. He shoved Devon back to the ground, this time with more force, sending him sprawling across the pavement. Jack yelped again, scrambling to his feet and rushing to Devon's side, licking at his face as if trying to comfort him. The officer sneered. "You really think you're worth something, huh? You think you're better than me?" He kicked the crutches out of the way, sending them skidding across the street, out of sight. "You're nothing. You're just another victim, like all the others. Just waiting to die." Devon's mind reeled as he lay there, staring at the officer through blurred vision. His body ached from the fall, his heart still pounding with the rush of adrenaline. The officer's words echoed in his head, each one a cruel reminder of everything he'd ever feared. He was just another black kid, just another statistic, a target to be knocked down and ignored. But something inside Devon stirred, something fierce, something that had been buried deep for years. It wasn't just about the dog. It wasn't just about the officer. It was about the system that had always treated him like this, that had always seen him as less than. It was about the endless stream of hatred and injustice, the way the world seemed to have already decided who he was and what his life would be worth. And in that moment, something shifted. Devon pushed himself up, his arms trembling with the effort, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't change everything, not here, not now. But there was something he could do. There was something he could fight for, and it started with standing up to this officer, to this world, to the fear that had paralyzed him for so long. The officer saw the change in Devon's eyes, the sudden spark of defiance, and his smirk faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. "Get back down," the officer growled, moving toward him, but Devon was already on his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He stood tall, taller than he had ever felt before, despite the weight of the world pressing down on him. Jack stood by his side, the little dog's tail wagging nervously, sensing the shift in the air. Devon looked the officer in the eye, his voice low but steady. "I'm not your slave, I'm not your target, and I'm not going anywhere." The officer's hand twitched toward his belt, and Devon braced himself for whatever was to come next. But something told him that this wasn't the end. Not yet. The air was thick with tension, but Devon knew he had just stepped into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Something was about to break. Devon could feel the officer's eyes on him, like a predator sizing up its prey. He stood there, legs shaking beneath him, but the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders felt different now. His body, battered and bruised from the fall, screamed in protest, but his resolve was harder, colder. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about survival, and this was about power. The officer's eyes narrowed as he sized Devon up, almost as if he was trying to decide what to do next. His lips twisted into that same cruel smile, the one that made Devon's skin crawl. He knew what that smile meant. The officer wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. "Did you hear me, boy?" the officer growled, taking a step forward. His boots echoed loudly on the pavement, each step a warning, a threat. "I said get down! Don't make me hurt you even more!" Devon's heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. His mind screamed at him to run, to do anything, anything but stand here, in the middle of this nightmare, where the whole world seemed to be watching him suffer. But his legs, his useless, trembling legs, wouldn't carry him far enough. And what was there to run to anyway? The city was full of people like this officer, people who saw him as less than, people who would turn a blind eye, pretend not to see the injustice happening right in front of them. He glanced at Jack, who was still crouching beside him, his small body trembling. The puppy had no idea what was happening. He just wanted to be close to Devon, to comfort him, to make it all go away. But Devon knew better. He couldn't keep running from the storm that had been chasing him his entire life. Devon swallowed hard, pushing the pain in his body to the back of his mind. He couldn't break. Not now. Not after everything that had led him to this point. I'm not going anywhere, Devon said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words were solid, unyielding. He wasn't going to let this officer, or anyone else, dictate his worth anymore. The officer's lips curled further into that sadistic smile. You think you have a choice in this, huh? You think you can talk back to me, a grown man in my city? You think you're better than me? He took another step forward, closing the gap between them. Devon could feel the officer's breath on his skin, a smell of stale coffee and something sour. It made his stomach turn. No, boy, the officer continued, his tone mocking. You're just another nigger trying to act tough. You're not tough. You're nothing. I could crush you under my boot if I wanted to, and no one would care. Devon's heart dropped. The words hit him like a slap, a reminder of everything he had ever feared. He'd heard it before, so many times, from other people who looked at him like he was trash, like he was worth nothing. But this was different. This was from a man in power, a man who could destroy him without a second thought, a man who had already made up his mind about what he was. And for the first time in his life, Devon felt a cold, unshakable truth settle into his bones. The world wasn't interested in his story. It wasn't interested in who he was or what he could become. To them, he was just a black kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer's hand shot out, grabbing Devon by the collar of his shirt, lifting him off the ground. His feet dangled helplessly, his body weightless for a brief moment before crashing back to the pavement. Devon's head spun, dizziness overtaking him. "Let me go!" Devon shouted, his voice hoarse. But it was no use. The officer laughed, a deep, hollow sound that sent shivers down Devon's spine. "What? You think I'm just going to let you go, little boy? Do you think anyone gives a damn about you?" Devon's vision blurred as the officer's grip tightened, the breath in his lungs becoming shallow. His mind screamed for him to fight back, to do something, anything, but his body felt like lead, every inch of him screaming out in agony. And then the officer dragged him to his feet, throwing him against the side of the patrol car with brutal force. Devon's back hit the cold metal, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He gasped for breath, his chest heaving as he struggled to stay upright. The officer stepped back, eyes scanning him as if he were a piece of trash to be discarded. "You want to keep acting tough, huh? You're not tough, boy. You're weak. You're nothing." Devon coughed, spitting blood onto the ground. His lip was split, his head aching from the force of the blow. But it wasn't the physical pain that stung the most. It was the humiliation, the feeling of being nothing. Jack, still cowering by his side, whined softly, as if he could sense his owner's pain. Devon reached down weakly to pet him, but the officer kicked the dog away. "Stay out of this, mutt," the officer sneered, his boot connecting with Jack's small body, sending the puppy tumbling across the pavement. Devon's stomach churned. He could feel the anger rising inside him, hot and sharp. This wasn't just about him. It was about everything. It was about the way the world had been built to break him, and people like him. And now, the officer wasn't just hurting him. He was hurting Jack, his only friend, the only thing in the world that had ever shown him love, without asking for anything in return. "No!" Devon cried out, his voice raw, desperation seeping through the cracks. The officer turned, sneering at him. "What's the matter, boy? Can't handle it? You think you're special. You're just a little black punk who doesn't know his place, and you never will." Devon's vision swam as the anger surged through him, but something else pushed through the rage. It was a sense of numbness, of resignation. He'd heard these words before, felt this sting before. This was his world. The one where people like him were nothing, where every step he took was a reminder of how small he was. But it was different now. Devon's eyes locked onto the officer's with an intensity that surprised even him. He had never looked at anyone like that before, never dared to. But now, with everything inside him burning, he did. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to let the officer take everything from him. "You don't get to decide who I am," Devon said, his voice shaking with a fury that he could no longer suppress. "You don't get to break me." The officer's expression faltered, just for a moment. But then it twisted back into something darker. You want to fight, huh? You think you can take me on? You're nothing but a broken toy, kid. You'll always be beneath me. Devon tried to stand taller, to hold his ground. But the officer was right. He wasn't a match for him, not physically. But that didn't mean he couldn't fight back. Maybe, Devon said, his voice low but steady. But I'm not going to let you win. Not like this. The officer's eyes narrowed. You think you have any power here? You're nothing but a pathetic, broken little kid. You think you can change anything? Devon's mouth felt dry, his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to look away. He had no idea what was coming next. He didn't know how much more he could take, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let the officer break him. Not today. The officer stared at him for a long moment, his hand twitching at his side, as if debating whether to strike again. But then, as if the decision had already been made, he pulled back and sneered. You're lucky I don't make this worse for you. But next time, boy, I won't show you any mercy. Devon watched the officer step back, his heart still racing, but his mind buzzing with the energy of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Defiance. The officer turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Devon standing there, battered and bruised, but not defeated. Not yet. As the officer disappeared around the corner, Devon couldn't help but feel a wave of disbelief wash over him. But as the adrenaline started to wear off, the true weight of what had just happened settled in. He had survived. For now. But the battle was far from over. The streets felt emptier now, more hollow, and Devon knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the war. It had only just begun. Let's take a short pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's continue. Devon's body ached, his legs still trembling beneath him as he watched the officer retreat into his patrol car. The man's words echoed in his mind, biting deeper than the physical pain ever could. You're nothing but a broken toy, kid, the officer had said. And in that moment, Devon had almost believed it. Almost. But as the officer's car drove off into the dimming twilight, leaving him standing alone in the street, a surge of defiance ignited deep within him. For the first time in a long while, Devon realized something. The officer wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of everything that had been broken in this world. The system, the prejudice, the violence. And Devon was the target. But he wasn't going to just lie down and accept it. Not anymore. Devon glanced down at Jack, the puppy, who was now cautiously stepping up to him, its small body still trembling, but brimming with loyalty. His heart ached at the sight of the little dog's fear. It was his only friend, his companion through everything. He had been protecting Jack, but now it was Jack who was comforting him. I'm sorry, buddy, Devon muttered, reaching down to gently stroke the puppy's fur. I didn't mean for this to happen. But Jack seemed to sense his words, nuzzling his face into Devon's hand as if to reassure him that it was all right. It wasn't, but somehow the gesture made Devon feel like he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. He wasn't ready to quit, not yet. But he knew the road ahead would be long, dangerous, and fraught with challenges he wasn't sure he could handle. The weight of what had just happened began to sink in, and Devon's mind started racing. He needed a plan. Something more than just surviving this street corner. There had to be more to life than this constant battle. He couldn't keep going through the motions, taking hit after hit, just to stay alive. But that was the reality, wasn't it? For kids like him, kids with no voice, no power, no choice, this was what the world was. Devon straightened up, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, and glanced around. The street was empty now, save for the faint glow of the streetlights and the distant hum of traffic. The air felt thick, the night closing in like a blanket of despair. It had been nearly 2 years since the accident that had taken away his ability to walk properly. 2 years of watching his world shrink, feeling the weight of the world's gaze every time he stepped outside. He'd never really fit in anywhere, and now, after the encounter with the officer, He realized just how deep the cuts ran. The world had already decided who he was, and it had nothing to do with his dreams, his potential, or his heart. The sound of tires screeching on the asphalt made him jump, his heart racing. He instinctively stepped back, dragging Jack closer to him as another patrol car screeched to a halt on the curb. "Not again," Devon muttered under his breath. He didn't want to deal with another officer, another round of humiliation, but the cold, hard truth was that he didn't have the luxury of choice. Not in a world that saw him as less than human. The door of the patrol car swung open with a thud, and another officer stepped out. This one was older, his face creased with lines that spoke of years spent enforcing the law. But it wasn't the officer's age that made Devon tense up. It was the unmistakable air of authority, the same type of man who could easily make Devon's life a living hell. "Hey, kid!" the officer called out, his voice gruff, the kind of voice that made you feel small and insignificant the moment you heard it. Devon didn't answer. He wasn't going to engage. Not this time. He refused to be dragged into another pointless interaction. His fists clenched at his sides as he turned away, making an effort to stand tall, even though he knew it wouldn't matter. He was just another black kid on the street, and that was the only thing that mattered. "Hey, I said stop!" the officer barked, his boots stomping against the pavement as he moved toward him. Devon took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but it was useless. Every fibre of his being screamed at him to run, to get away, but his legs weren't up to it. Instead, he stood there, eyes straight ahead, determined to show the officer that he wasn't afraid. But the officer wasn't in the mood for games. "Is there a problem, kid?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Why are you out here? You lost." Devon swallowed, refusing to meet the officer's gaze. "I'm fine." The officer scoffed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his throat. "Yeah, I bet. Just another punk looking for trouble, huh? What's your name?" Devon didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction. The officer wasn't interested in his name. He didn't care who Devon was. He just wanted to remind him of his place. The officer took another step closer, looming over Devon, his shadow stretching across the sidewalk. "You don't have the right to ignore me. Don't you think I can do something about that?" Devon's chest tightened, but he held his ground, his fists still clenched at his sides. He wanted to speak out, to scream at this man that he had no right to treat him like this. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, the officer reached out, grabbing hold of Devon's arm roughly. "Come here, let's talk," the officer said, his grip like iron. "Let go of me," Devon said quietly, his voice barely audible. But the officer wasn't listening. With a jerk of his arm, the officer pulled Devon closer, forcing him toward the patrol car. Jack growled softly, his little body vibrating with tension as he barked, trying to protect his owner. "Shut up, dog," the officer muttered, kicking Jack away. The puppy yelped, scrambling back toward Devon's feet. Devon felt the familiar sting of helplessness rise in his chest. He couldn't even protect Jack. He couldn't protect himself. He was at the officer's mercy, and that was a cruel thing. "Please stop," Devon begged, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm not doing anything wrong. Just leave me alone." But the officer wasn't stopping. He was dragging him toward the patrol car, his grip unyielding. Every step felt like a violation. Devon's world seemed to shrink with each movement, the weight of this man's power crushing him. "You think you're something special, huh? You're just another nuisance. Another black kid in the wrong place," the officer sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "What do you think's gonna happen, huh? You think anyone cares about you? You think anyone's gonna notice when you're gone?" Devon's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. The officer's words hit too close to home, too painfully. It wasn't just about him. It was about the millions of people like him. People who had never stood a chance in this world. The officer reached for his cuffs, the cold metal glinting in the streetlight. "You're coming with me, kid. I'm taking you in." Devon's mind raced, panic setting in as he realized there was nothing he could do. He couldn't fight back. He couldn't run. He could only stand there, waiting for the inevitable. But as the officer reached for his arm, something inside Devon snapped. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care about the power this officer had. He reached down, grabbing Jack and pulling him close. Then, with every ounce of strength he could muster, Devon shoved the officer back. "You don't own me," Devon shouted, his voice raw and desperate. "You don't get to decide my life." The officer stumbled back, shocked by the sudden outburst. He had expected fear. He had expected submission. But he hadn't expected defiance. And in that moment, Devon realized that he had done the one thing that mattered. He had taken back his power, even if just for a moment. But that moment was enough. And the officer? He wasn't ready for what came next. The tension in the air was palpable. The officer's face twisted with rage, but Devon stood his ground. He didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he was ready to face it head on. This was far from over. The road ahead would be long, but Devon had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life, and no one could take that away from him. Not anymore. Devon stood still, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of his breath, his body trembling from both the adrenaline and the fear that had gripped him. His hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white with tension, but he didn't let them betray him. His heart was hammering against his ribs, the thumping in his chest a constant reminder of just how close he had come to losing everything. His legs, still weak from the encounter earlier, felt as if they were made of rubber. But somehow, he stayed upright, unwilling to back down. The officer's stunned face was all that met him. A moment of disbelief passed between them, the officer looking at him as if seeing something entirely different. It wasn't just a rebellious kid in front of him anymore. It was a challenge. The officer recovered quickly, a twisted sneer curling on his lips. The defiance in Devon's eyes, the courage he had found from somewhere deep inside, only seemed to fuel the officer's fury. "You think you're a tough guy, huh?" The officer spat, his voice laced with disgust. "You think you're something special?" He took a step closer to Devon, and with every movement, it became clear that the officer was about to bring the full weight of his authority down on him. Devon's mouth went dry, but he stood his ground. He didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "You think you're a real man, huh? Look at you. Just another broken kid, running around like you own the world. You don't own anything. Not your life, not your body, not your future. You're just a black kid who doesn't know his place," the officer continued, his words coming faster, more venomous. His eyes blazed with the kind of hate that Devon had seen 1,000 times before, and every word stung deeper than the last. "I'm not afraid of you," Devon said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I'm not afraid of anyone anymore." The officer's expression faltered for a second, as if taken aback by the defiance. But then his eyes narrowed, and the sneer returned. "Oh, you're not afraid? That's real cute. You're not afraid of what I can do to you? Of what this city can do to you?" he growled. The officer's voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper. "You don't get to decide when you're done, kid. I do, and when I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never even been born." Devon's mind raced, but there was no escaping this. No running, no hiding. He knew that. He'd always known. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system, the constant oppression, the fear that ran through every black body walking the streets of a city like this. They didn't have to say it. It was in the air, in the glances, in the way people moved when they saw him. He wasn't a person to them. He was a statistic, a threat. And this officer? He was just a cog in the machine. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt with a deliberate slowness. The cold metallic sound of the cuffs being clicked open, sending a chill down Devon's spine. "You're going to jail, boy, and I'm not going to make it easy for you," the officer said, his voice a cruel mix of amusement and malice. Devon's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation pushing him closer to the edge, but deep inside, something was beginning to break free, a force he hadn't known he had. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not like this. "No," Devon said, his voice gaining strength as he took a step back. "I'm not going with you." The officer's face twisted in anger, his hand reaching out to grab Devon's arm. But before he could make contact, something snapped. The air seemed to thicken around them, and in one fluid motion, Devon pushed the officer back with everything he had. It wasn't much, it wasn't enough, but it was a start. The officer stumbled, surprise flashing across his face for a moment, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by rage. "You're going to regret that," he snarled. "I promise you, I'll make sure you regret that." The officer lunged at Devon, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the patrol car with a sickening thud. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, and Devon's head spun from the force. He barely had time to react before the officer's fist collided with his stomach. The pain was sharp and immediate, and Devon gasped for air, his body folding in on itself. "You think you can stand up to me? You think you can fight back?" the officer growled, landing another punch to Devon's ribs. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Every blow sent shockwaves through Devon's body, but he refused to cry out. He refused to let the officer hear him suffer. He clenched his teeth, holding on to the faint spark of defiance that still burned inside him. But the officer wasn't done. He grabbed Devon's face with both hands, shoving him hard against the car, the metal digging into his skin. "You want to know what your kind is good for?" the officer hissed. "Nothing. You're good for nothing. You don't belong here." Devon's body screamed in pain, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. He was drowning in the officer's hatred, in the overwhelming weight of it. But a small part of him, that piece he had fought so hard to protect, remained untouched. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He refused to believe that it was. Through the haze of pain, Devon forced himself to focus. He couldn't let this be the moment that broke him. He wouldn't let it. As the officer continued to taunt him, slamming his body into the car, Devon's mind cleared for a brief moment. He remembered who he was. He remembered the boy who had fought for his life every single day. He wasn't just a target. He wasn't just a victim. He was more than that. He had to be. The officer was still ranting, still pushing him against the car, his hands gripping Devon's collar like a vice. But Devon didn't hear him anymore. He didn't care about the officer's words. He didn't care about the pain. All that mattered was that Devon was still standing. He was still alive. And as long as he was alive, he had a chance. The officer leaned in, his breath hot and rancid against Devon's ear. "You're just a joke, boy. That's all you'll ever be. You'll always be beneath me." Devon's vision blurred, but his mind was sharper than ever. He couldn't let this man take everything from him. He couldn't let him win. As the officer's grip tightened, Devon pushed back, using every ounce of strength he had left. The officer staggered, momentarily off balance, and in that fleeting second, Devon found his moment. With one forceful movement, he broke free from the officer's grasp, pushing him back with his shoulder and stumbling away. The officer recovered quickly, but it was too late. Devon had made it clear. He wasn't going down without a fight. The officer stood there, seething, his face red with fury. But Devon didn't wait for him to move. He turned and limped down the street, Jack following closely behind. His legs wobbled with the effort, but Devon didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The officer didn't pursue him immediately. He stood there for a moment, fists clenched, watching as Devon made his escape. But Devon knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer would be back. He would be waiting. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. As Devon walked away, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on him. The pain in his body was intense, but it was nothing compared to the fire that burned in his chest. He wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't going to let them turn him into one. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not today. Not ever. Jack trotted alongside him, his little body still trembling but sticking close, offering silent support. Together, they kept moving forward. For the first time in a long time, Devon felt like he was in control of something. And that, for him, was everything. Devon limped through the quiet streets, Jack trotting beside him, still shaken but loyal as ever. His mind was a storm of thoughts, each one racing faster than the last. His legs were sore, and the bruises from the officer's blows already began to surface, the pain sharp and constant. But it wasn't the physical pain that weighed on him now. It was the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had taken root in the pit of his stomach. He had escaped the officer's grasp, at least for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The streets around him were empty, save for the distant hum of traffic, but Devon couldn't shake the feeling that the world was closing in on him. He didn't belong here. Not in this city. Not in this world. Every corner he turned, every face he passed, told him the same thing. He was different. He wasn't welcome. And now, after what had happened with the officer, Devon knew that things were only going to get worse. The world hadn't just decided that he was different. It had decided that he didn't matter. Not at all. He had seen the look in the officer's eyes when he shoved him against the patrol car. The look of someone who knew, with certainty, that he could do whatever he wanted to Devon, and there would be no consequences. It wasn't just one officer. It was the system, the way the world worked, and no matter how many times Devon ran, no matter how many times he stood up to them, it would never change. The weight of that realization was suffocating. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger. He had fought back, sure, but it had felt like a fleeting victory, one that could be erased with a single phone call. The officer could have easily come after him, could have thrown him in jail, made up any lie he wanted to justify it, and there would be no one to stop him. No one who cared. It wasn't just about what the officer had done. It was about what the officer represented. He was a cog in a much larger machine, one that had been built to keep people like Devon in their place. The injustice ran deep, like a sickness that permeated every level of society, and no one seemed willing to do anything about it. They had already decided what Devon's life was worth. They had already decided what he was allowed to be. He was nothing, a problem to be erased, a target to be put down. Devon pushed those thoughts aside, willing himself to focus. He had to keep moving. He couldn't afford to stop. His apartment wasn't far, just a few more blocks ahead. A small, run-down building on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was the one place in the world where he could feel some semblance of control, even if it was just a small piece of it. He reached the building and made his way up the stairs, Jack following closely behind, the little dog's tail wagging nervously. Devon unlocked the door to his apartment, the creaking of the hinges echoing through the quiet hallway. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished. There was a couch, a coffee table, and a small TV that barely worked. The walls were bare, except for a few posters he had put up to remind him of better days. Days when he still had hope. He closed the door behind him, locking it with a loud click. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Jack jumped up onto the couch, curling up in the corner, and Devon sat down beside him, his head resting in his hands. The weight of the day pressed down on him, every memory of what had happened flooding his mind. The officer's words, the look in his eyes, the feeling of being nothing. He had tried to fight back, tried to stand his ground, but now that he was alone, he couldn't help but wonder, was it enough? He stared at the blank walls around him, the silence of the apartment settling in like a heavy blanket. There was no escape, no place to hide. He was trapped, stuck in a world that had already decided who he was and what he would become. He had no choice but to keep fighting, to keep pushing back against a system that didn't care. But that didn't make it any easier. In fact, it only made it worse. The realization that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he fought back, it wouldn't matter. Because they were always going to win. They had the power. They had the control. They had the system. And people like Devon were always going to be at the mercy of it. The thought gnawed at him. He could feel the anger rising in his chest again, the heat of it burning through his veins. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep fighting against something that would never change. But then he thought of Jack, curled up beside him, the small dog that had stayed by his side through it all. Jack had never judged him. Jack had never looked at him like he was a problem, like he was a threat. Jack had just been there, a small beacon of light in a world that seemed determined to drown him. And in that moment, Devon realized something. Maybe he couldn't change the world. Maybe he couldn't take down the system, but he could change his own story. He could decide who he was. He could decide what he was worth. He wasn't going to be broken. Not today, not tomorrow. He wouldn't let them win. He stood up, wiping the sweat from his brow, and walked over to the small window in the corner of the room. The street outside was still empty, but the city was alive. People were moving, going about their lives, unaware of the pain and the injustice that was lurking just beneath the surface. They didn't see it. They didn't have to. They didn't have to live it. But Devon did, and he wasn't going to let it destroy him. He wasn't going to let them decide who he was. He wasn't going to let them win. He turned away from the window and walked back to the couch, sitting down next to Jack once more. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging slowly, and Devon reached down to scratch his head. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade away, and it was just the two of them, existing in this tiny, quiet space. And in that moment, Devon felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. He wasn't alone. He wasn't powerless. He had Jack, and he had himself. That was all he needed. The road ahead was uncertain, full of obstacles and challenges, but Devon knew that he would face it head on. He wasn't going to let them take away his dignity, his humanity. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not ever. Jack let out a soft whine, and Devon smiled, his heart lightening just a little. They had made it this far. They could make it farther. He wasn't going to let them take away the only thing that mattered. His fight was just beginning. The following days were a blur. Devon kept to the shadows, moving through the streets like a ghost, always watching his back, always listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. The officer's threats still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how easily his life could be taken away, of how little value it had in the eyes of those with power. He couldn't escape that reality. Not really. There was no hiding from the truth that he was just another black kid in a city full of people who would never see him as anything more than a problem to be dealt with, a threat to be neutralized. His small apartment, once a place of solitude and security, now felt like a cage. The walls, once a quiet sanctuary, now seemed to close in on him, trapping him in his own thoughts. Jack stayed close by his side, the dog's constant presence a small comfort in an increasingly hostile world. But even Jack couldn't chase away the weight that pressed down on Devon's chest, the weight of knowing that every moment he spent in this city brought him closer to something worse than what he had already endured. Every time he stepped outside, he risked being targeted, harassed, humiliated. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the entire system that upheld the kind of violence and racism that had nearly crushed him that night. Devon had spent his whole life trying to survive in a world that didn't want him to succeed, trying to carve out a place for himself in a society that told him time and time again that he wasn't welcome. But now, the idea of survival felt hollow. It felt like running in circles, always getting closer to the edge, but never being able to break free. He couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, he would always be stuck on the wrong side of the line that separated people like him from everyone else, the line that kept him trapped in a world that refused to acknowledge his humanity. And yet, even as he battled with these thoughts, there was a part of him that refused to give up, a part of him that still clung to the idea of fighting back, of standing up to the forces that sought to destroy him. It was a small spark, but it was still there, buried deep beneath the crushing weight of despair. But that spark was fading, dimming in the face of overwhelming odds. The days stretched into weeks, and the fear began to take hold of him. He couldn't go outside without feeling like someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The eyes of the world seemed to be fixed on him, scrutinizing his every move, judging him for the color of his skin, for his mere existence. And the worst part was, he didn't know how to fight back. Not really. There was no clear path forward, no manual for how to survive in a world that hated you, that saw you as less than human. But Devon couldn't afford to stay inside forever. He couldn't let fear keep him locked in his apartment, hidden away from the world. The streets might be dangerous, but they were also the only place where he could try to find some semblance of control. One afternoon, he decided to leave. He put on his jacket, grabbed Jack's leash, and stepped out into the world, determined to face it head on. The moment he stepped outside, he felt it, the weight of the eyes that followed him, the whispers that followed in his wake. He could hear the distant sound of laughter, the low murmur of voices talking about him, judging him. But Devon kept his head high, his shoulders straight, and kept walking. He had no choice but to walk forward, to face the world head on, no matter how much it tried to break him. He walked for what felt like hours, turning down one street after another, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of his own footsteps. Jack trotted happily beside him, his little tail wagging as he sniffed at the ground, oblivious to the tension in the air. Devon could feel the eyes on him, though. People watched him from behind windows, from doorways, from across the street. They were always watching. They always had been. It was a feeling he had grown up with, like he was under a constant microscope, like everyone was waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to prove that he didn't belong. And then, as if to prove his point, it happened. A car pulled up beside him, its engine rumbling loudly as it slowed to a stop. The window rolled down, and a voice called out, "Hey you! Yeah, you! What the hell are you doing out here?" Devon stopped, his heart skipping a beat. He knew that voice. It was a man he had seen around the neighborhood before, someone who didn't hesitate to remind him of his place. He turned slowly, forcing himself to keep calm, to not let the fear take over. "What do you want?" Devon asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building inside him. "What do I want? I'm just asking what the hell you're doing out here, boy," the man said, sneering as he leaned out of the car window. "You think you own these streets? Think you can just walk around like you're one of us?" Devon's blood ran cold. The man's eyes were cold, predatory. There was something dangerous in the way he spoke, something that made Devon's skin crawl. He had heard it before, this tone, this way of speaking to him, as if he were nothing, as if he were less than human. Devon felt the familiar knot of anger and fear twist in his stomach. He couldn't stand this. He couldn't stand the way people treated him, like he was some kind of animal to be caged, to be controlled. But he knew better than to react. He had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. So instead, he took a deep breath and met the man's gaze, holding it steady. "I'm just walking," Devon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not bothering anyone." The man snorted. "You're always bothering someone. That's the problem with people like you." The words hit Devon like a slap, and for a moment he felt like he was drowning in them. He wanted to scream, to tell the man exactly what he thought of him, to let out all the rage and frustration that had been building inside him. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had learned the hard way that words wouldn't change anything. Not here, not in this world. The man leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the power he held over Devon. "You better watch where you're walking, boy. People like you don't belong out here." With that, the man rolled up his window and drove off, leaving Devon standing there, rooted to the spot, Jack's leash tight in his hand. Devon's mind was reeling, his chest tight with the weight of the humiliation. The man had said nothing new, nothing he hadn't heard before. But it still cut deeper than any of the physical blows he had taken. He wasn't just being disrespected, he was being erased. Every time someone like that man opened his mouth, every time they made him feel small, like he didn't belong, they were trying to erase him from existence. It was a constant battle, a battle to hold on to his own humanity, to remind himself that he was more than the labels they had placed on him. He wasn't just a black kid walking the streets. He wasn't just a problem to be solved. But no matter how many times he told himself that, it didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the feeling that the world was closing in on him, that it was always just a matter of time before someone else would try to put him back in his place. He took another deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this defeat him. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. He had fought too hard to let it end like this. Jack tugged on the leash, eager to keep walking, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Devon looked down at the dog, his heart swelling with gratitude. Jack was all he had, his only companion in this fight. And if nothing else, he couldn't let Jack down. So he started walking again, one step at a time. Every step was a reminder that he wasn't giving up, that he wasn't going to let them win. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but as long as he kept moving forward, he had a chance. And that, for now, was enough. Devon woke up to the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, the shrill sound slicing through the morning air like a knife. The room was dim, the faint light filtering through the cracked blinds of his small apartment, casting long shadows across the room. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, still feeling the weight of the previous day's events pressing down on him. Jack was curled up at his feet, the dog's soft breathing a reminder of the small comforts in his life. Devon's thoughts raced as he stared at the peeling wallpaper in front of him, his mind still spinning from the encounter with the man on the street. It had been days since the incident, but the words still echoed in his ears, haunting him. People like you don't belong out here. It wasn't the first time he had heard such words. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him as if he were less than human, less than a person with rights, with dignity. But it felt different this time. The man's words had dug deep, deeper than any insult he had ever received before. It wasn't just about being black. It wasn't just about the color of his skin or the way the world saw him. It was about the realization that he wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to exist. He had always known the world saw him as less than. He had always known that, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many times he tried to prove his worth, there would always be someone out there who saw him as a threat, who wanted him to disappear. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in faster. There was no escaping the fact that this world was designed to break him. It wasn't just one man on the street, one cop in a patrol car. It was an entire system that had been built to push people like him down, to keep them in their place, to keep them from ever reaching for something more. Devon stood up from the bed, his muscles aching from the strain of the last few days. He walked over to the small window, pulling the blinds apart and peering out. The city was still waking up, the streets beginning to fill with the early morning hustle of people going about their lives, oblivious to the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. He had spent years trying to keep his head down, trying to stay out of the way, to avoid confrontation. But now, it felt like there was no way to avoid it. No way to stay out of the line of fire. The sirens in the distance grew louder, and for a brief moment, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. But the truth was, it was already too late. The world was already paying attention, and the more he tried to hide, the more they watched, waiting for him to slip. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding in his apartment, hoping that it would all just go away. He had tried that before, and it had only made things worse. So, he put on his jacket and grabbed Jack's leash, his fingers trembling as he clipped it onto the dog's collar. He wasn't sure what he was looking for as he stepped out onto the street. Maybe he was looking for answers. Maybe he was looking for a way to make sense of it all. Or maybe he was just looking for a place to exist without constantly feeling like he was under threat. But as soon as he stepped out into the sunlight, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. It was like a cloud hanging overhead, always there, always watching. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the small things. The sound of Jack's paws on the pavement, the way the morning light filtered through the trees. But the more he walked, the more he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. Devon had only made it a few blocks before the familiar hum of a car engine filled the air. He looked up, his stomach dropping when he saw the patrol car pulling up beside him. His breath caught in his throat as the window rolled down. "Hey boy," the officer called out, his tone dripping with disdain. "You still out here causing trouble?" Devon's heart raced, and for a moment, he felt like he might just crumble under the weight of the officer's gaze. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped, but each encounter felt like a slow torture. They didn't even have to say anything anymore. Their eyes, their tone, their presence, it all spoke volumes. It was enough to remind him that he was never safe. "I'm just walking," Devon said, his voice flat, his eyes focused on the sidewalk in front of him, trying to avoid the officer's gaze. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" The officer's voice was low, menacing, and for a moment Devon thought he might crack. But he didn't. He wouldn't. Not now. Not after everything. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Devon replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Devon's spine. "Not doing anything wrong? You people never think you're doing anything wrong. You always think you're the victim." The words hit Devon like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to scream. But instead, he clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. "You don't belong here," the officer continued, his eyes narrowing. "People like you don't belong in this part of the city. You don't deserve to walk these streets." Devon's blood ran cold as the officer's words pierced through him like a blade. He had heard it all before, the subtle racism that permeated every corner of this city, every corner of the world. It wasn't just about what the officer said. It was about how he said it, how he saw Devon as less than, how he saw every black body as a threat to be controlled. The officer leaned out of the car, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You should get out of here before I make you regret it." Devon's throat tightened, his breath coming in short gasps. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight back. All he could do was stand there, frozen, as the officer's eyes bored into him. "I'm not going anywhere," Devon said, his voice shaking, but firm. "You better think twice before you make me angry," the officer warned, his voice low, threatening. The car's engine revved, and with one last sneer, the officer rolled up the window, speeding off down the street. Devon stood there, his legs shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. The encounter had been brief, but it had shaken him to his core. He had survived, but only by the skin of his teeth. And the worst part? It was only going to get worse. There was no escaping it. He was always going to be a target. He was always going to be seen as less than human. But Devon wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not ever. He looked down at Jack, the small dog still at his side, looking up at him with those trusting eyes. Jack was the only one who hadn't judged him, the only one who saw him for who he really was, and that, in a world full of hatred and prejudice, was enough to keep fighting. With Jack by his side, Devon knew he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to keep moving forward. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges that seemed insurmountable. But Devon wasn't afraid anymore. Not really. Because as long as he had breath in his lungs, he had a chance. And that was enough. The morning after the encounter with the officer, Devon couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the sharp sting of the officer's words, the heavy weight of their implications. It was the way they made him feel like he was a target, something to be controlled, something that could be erased with a single push. He had spent years walking this tightrope, trying to stay out of trouble, trying to avoid the inevitable encounters that had become his reality. But it wasn't enough anymore. It had never been enough. The world was closing in, and no matter how far he ran, how many corners he turned, it seemed like the walls kept getting higher, taller, until there was no place to go. Jack, his loyal companion, sat by his feet, tail wagging softly, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Devon. The little dog had been the only constant in a world that constantly sought to remind him of his place, in a world that constantly reminded him that people like him weren't meant to exist in spaces of power, in spaces of wealth. They were meant to be invisible, subjugated. He couldn't afford to think like that, but it was hard not to. It was hard not to feel the weight of it when every encounter, every look seemed to confirm it. He had always known that the world wasn't built for him, not for people who looked like him. But now, the realization had become inescapable. The officer's words had pierced something deeper than just his skin. They had sunk into his soul, gnawing at the small thread of hope that he had left. And the worst part, Devon had no idea how to fight back. He had no idea how to change the system that was built to break him. But something had changed inside him. There was a fire inside him now, something that had been burning for years, but had never had the chance to ignite. He was tired. He was tired of being afraid, of hiding in the shadows, of accepting the injustice that surrounded him. Tired of being the invisible one, the one people stepped around or stepped on. He was tired of letting others define who he was. He had to do something. Anything. The idea came to him slowly, a whisper in the back of his mind, something he had been pushing away for years. But now, it felt like the only way forward. The only way to take back the power he had lost. He would make them see him, make them acknowledge his existence, not just as a threat, not just as a symbol of what they feared, but as a person, someone who mattered. His chest tightened as the thought took root. He wasn't sure how to make it happen. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to go through with it. But he couldn't keep living like this, on the edge, always waiting for the next blow. He needed to be seen. He needed to make his voice heard. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Devon stood up from the couch and walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. The same street he had walked countless times before. The same street that had never been kind to him. The street where people looked through him, over him, as if he didn't exist. But that was about to change. He knew that. It had to. The city was a sprawling mess of concrete and steel, but to Devon, it had always felt like a cage. No matter where he went, no matter what he did, there was always a door locked behind him, a door he couldn't escape. He walked down the hall to the small bathroom in his apartment and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man staring back at him looked tired. Too tired for someone so young. His face was bruised from the altercation with the officer, the memory of the officer's fist still fresh in his mind. But it wasn't just the bruises that showed. It was the resignation in his eyes, the way he had been beaten down by the world, the way he had been broken so many times before. He could feel his resolve crumbling, but then he remembered the officer's words again. People like you don't belong out here. They echoed in his mind like a battle cry, a challenge, a reminder that he had to fight, not for anyone else, not for the world, but for himself, for his dignity, for his humanity. Devon wasn't going to let the world define him. He wasn't going to let them put him in a box, tell him who he was and who he wasn't. He had to fight for his place. He had to make them see him. His fingers curled into fists as he stared at his reflection. He wasn't going to be invisible anymore. He wasn't going to cower. He wasn't going to hide. He was done being silent, done waiting for permission to exist. The plan was simple, but it wasn't without its risks. Devon knew what would happen if he made a scene. He knew what would happen if he stood up and made his presence known. It could cost him everything. But what had he been living for if not this? What was the point of surviving if you were never allowed to truly live? He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. The fight was bigger than him. It had always been bigger than him. And now, for the first time, Devon felt like he was ready to face it. The sun was beginning to set when he left the apartment, Jack following closely behind him, as if he could sense the shift in Devon's energy. The streets were still bustling with people, but Devon felt a sudden clarity as he walked. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was out in the open, walking through the world like he belonged in it. The feeling of defiance burned in his chest, warming him against the cold air. He didn't have a plan, not really. But that didn't matter. He had something more important. His voice. And for once, he was going to use it. As he walked down the street, the feeling of eyes on him grew stronger. People looked, some with curiosity, some with judgment. He could feel their gazes piercing him, weighing him, trying to figure him out. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He just kept walking. Every step was a statement. Every step was a reminder that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. He had no idea where he was headed. He just knew that he couldn't stop. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned the corner, walking toward the busy part of the city, the heart of it, the place where people had everything to lose and everything to gain. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but he wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for a way forward. It didn't take long for a group of people to notice him, a group of men who stood on the corner, their eyes following him as he walked by. He had seen them before, hanging out on the street, talking loudly, laughing. But now, as they saw him coming, their expressions changed. The laughter faded, The smiles disappeared. Devon's stomach twisted, and for a moment he almost turned away, almost ran. But then he remembered why he was there. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. He wasn't going to let them define him. He wasn't going to let them make him shrink back. He was done with that. One of the men called out to him, a taunting smile on his face. "What's up, boy? You lost or something?" Devon didn't answer. He kept walking, his eyes straight ahead, determined to make it to the end of the block. The man called out again, louder this time. "You think you own this street, huh?" Devon could feel the anger rising inside him, but he kept walking, refusing to acknowledge the taunt. But the man wasn't finished. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Devon's heart pounded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the fire of anger flare in his chest. He stopped walking. Slowly, he turned around and faced the man, his eyes locking with his. "I'm not nothing," Devon said, his voice steady, but loud enough for the group to hear. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me who I am." For a moment, there was silence. The man's face twisted in surprise, and the group behind him exchanged uneasy glances. Devon stood tall, his head high, his fists clenched at his sides. "I matter," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "I matter, and you can't take that from me." The group fell quiet, no one daring to speak. For the first time, Devon felt like he was truly seen. The feeling was overwhelming, like a weight lifting off his chest. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just a black kid walking through the streets. He was Devon. He was someone who mattered. The group stood there, unsure of what to do. Devon didn't wait for them to respond. He turned and walked away, his pace steady, Jack at his side. It didn't matter what they said. It didn't matter what anyone said. For the first time in his life, Devon felt like he had made his mark on the world. And that was enough. The night Devon stood tall in front of that group of men was the first time in a long while that he felt like he was truly breathing. For the first time, he had stood his ground and refused to let the world define him, to let it decide his fate. But the moment he turned his back to walk away, he felt a weight settle in his chest. The weight of uncertainty, the weight of what he had just done, and what might come next. As he continued down the street, Jack trotting beside him, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced with a quiet hum of dread. The city seemed the same as it always had, alive, buzzing with movement. But Devon knew that this time, it wasn't the same. This time, he had made himself visible. And visibility, in a world that thrives on erasure, comes with a cost. Every corner he turned, every shadow in his periphery, felt like a potential threat. His body tensed, anticipating the moment when someone would show up. Another officer, another group of people, just waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. It didn't take long for the uneasy silence to be shattered by the unmistakable sound of a car's engine rumbling nearby. Devon's heart skipped a beat. He didn't turn around, didn't look at the car as it slowly rolled up behind him. He had learned long ago that looking back only invited trouble, but his instincts told him it was time to brace himself. He quickened his pace, his legs protesting, but driven by a surge of adrenaline he couldn't contain. Jack, sensing the change in Devon's energy, began to bark softly, almost as if to warn him, to protect him. The car stopped beside him, the engine humming for a moment before the window rolled down. "Hey you!" a voice called out. The tone was harsh, sharp, an unmistakable demand. It was the same officer from before. Devon's stomach churned. The air around him seemed to tighten, each breath coming harder than the last. He wanted to run, to get out of there, but he couldn't. His legs were already shaking from the tension. Jack stopped barking, his tail now tucked between his legs, as if sensing the danger. Devon didn't stop. He kept walking, his eyes straight ahead. He wouldn't let them break him now, not after everything. "I'm talking to you," the officer called again, his voice louder this time. "You think you're too good to listen now? You think you're untouchable?" Devon heard the sound of the car door opening. His heart raced. He knew what was coming next. He could already feel the weight of the officer's anger closing in. And just like that, all the fear he had been trying to suppress came rushing back. He tried to steady himself, but his hands were clammy, his chest tight. The officer was walking toward him now, his boots clicking against the pavement with a rhythmic certainty. The fear in Devon's chest began to swell, but he fought it down, forcing himself to take each step forward as though it was just another day. But it wasn't. Devon stopped when he was just a few feet away from the officer. He could feel the anger radiating from the man. The officer's breath smelled like stale coffee, his eyes burning with that same cruel, condescending look. "You don't know your place, do you?" The officer sneered. "You think you can just walk through here, act like you own the streets?" Devon's heart pounded in his ears, but he didn't flinch. He refused to let the officer see his fear. He had already made that mistake too many times. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Devon said, his voice shaking slightly, but he refused to back down. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of ridicule. "Get home? You don't get to have a home here. People like you don't get to be anywhere but where we tell you to be." The words hit Devon harder than any punch ever could. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his entire body shaking with the effort to keep his composure. He had heard this before. People like him didn't belong, weren't welcome. But this was different. The officer wasn't just trying to control him. He was trying to strip him of his humanity. "You know," the officer continued, moving closer, "you should be grateful I don't do something about your disrespect. You're a problem, kid. People like you always are." Devon could feel the pressure building in his chest. He wanted to shout back, to scream at this officer that he wasn't a problem, that he was just a person, just someone trying to survive in a world that hated him for no reason. He opened his mouth, but the officer raised a hand, silencing him with a wave. "You're not going to talk back to me, are you?" the officer growled. "You should know your place, or I'll make sure you find out the hard way." Devon's heart was racing. Every part of him was telling him to walk away, to get out of there before it escalated further. But there was something inside him, a feeling that had been building up for so long, that refused to let him back down. He had stood up once, and he wasn't going to let this officer take that away from him. "I'm not afraid of you," Devon said, his voice growing stronger, more confident. He wasn't sure where the strength was coming from, but he clung to it like a lifeline. "You don't control me. You don't get to tell me where I belong. Not anymore." The officer's face twisted with fury, and for a moment, Devon thought the man might hit him, might push him down just like before. But he didn't. Instead, the officer stepped back, his eyes flashing with disgust. "You think you can just talk like that? You think you're better than me?" The officer spat, his voice seething with venom. "You're nothing." Devon didn't say a word. He just stared at the officer, standing his ground. In that moment, it felt like time stood still. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving just him and the officer, the tension thick in the air. He could feel his chest tightening with the weight of everything, the injustice, the humiliation, the anger, all of it mixing into a force he couldn't suppress. "Get out of here before I make you regret it," the officer warned, his voice low and dangerous. Devon's heart thundered in his chest, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to let this man push him around. Not again. Not ever. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words, the officer glaring at him, and Devon holding his ground. Finally, the officer scoffed, muttering something under his breath before turning and walking back to his car. "Don't come back around here, boy," the officer called over his shoulder, his tone dripping with finality. Devon didn't respond. He didn't need to. He wasn't going to let this man have the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten to him. He watched as the officer got back in the car and sped off, the tires screeching on the asphalt. Devon stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. He had survived. Again. But it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing tall, about refusing to let the world break him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, invisible. He had made his mark on this world, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Not anymore. As he turned to walk home, Jack trotting happily beside him, Devon felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, He felt like he was on the path to something greater, something real, and no one could take that from him. Not anymore. He wasn't invisible. Not anymore. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Devon's journey and the challenges he faced? Have you ever encountered moments of racism in your own life? Your stories, your feedback, and your experiences are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to know what you think and hear your perspectives. Wishing you all a wonderful day ahead, and to show us that you've listened to the end, drop a comment with the phrase, "We are not invisible." It'll help us know you're with us till the very last word. Thank you for being part of this journey.